Captain William Harris stood at attention outside Kensington Palace, his polished black boots firmly planted on the cobblestone path. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds, and the familiar weight of his ceremonial sword hung at his side. At 52 years old, William had served the royal family for over 3 decades, earning respect from colleagues and admiration from the public, who often stopped to photograph the stoic guards. His weathered hands gripped his rifle with the same precision they had for 30 years. The red tunic, adorned with golden buttons and braiding, fit his broad shoulders perfectly despite the passing years. His black bearskin hat sat high on his head, a symbol of tradition and honor that had been worn by generations of guards before him. William had seen 3 monarchs during his service. He remembered standing guard during Queen Elizabeth's final years, witnessing the transition to King Charles, and now protecting the next generation of royals. Each day brought its own challenges, but none quite like what was about to unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. The palace grounds were quieter than usual. Most of the royal family was away on official duties, leaving only a skeleton crew of staff and security. Prince George, now 15 years old, had stayed behind to continue his studies with his private tutors. The young prince had grown considerably over the past year, his voice deeper and his manner more thoughtful than the playful child William remembered from years past. As William maintained his post, he noticed movement in one of the upper windows of the palace. Prince George appeared briefly, adjusting the curtains in what looked like his study room. The boy glanced down at the courtyard where William stood, their eyes meeting for just a moment, before the prince disappeared back into the room. William had always felt a special connection to Prince George, though they had never spoken directly. Royal protocol strictly forbade casual conversation between guards and family members unless in an emergency. But over the years, William had observed the young prince growing up, playing in the gardens, attending formal events, and gradually taking on more responsibilities as he matured. The captain remembered the day Prince George was born. William had been on duty that July evening in 2013, standing guard as news of the birth spread throughout the palace. The excitement among the staff was infectious, and even the usually stoic guards couldn't help but smile as they maintained their posts. Now, 12 years later, that same baby had become a thoughtful teenager who would one day inherit tremendous responsibility. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees that dotted the palace grounds. William's mind wandered to his own family. His wife, Margaret, who had supported his demanding career with unwavering patience, and his daughter, Sarah, now 25, and working as a teacher in London. They had made countless sacrifices for his service to the crown, understanding that duty came before personal convenience. Margaret often joked that William was more dedicated to the royal family than to his own, though she said it with love and pride. She had attended numerous ceremonies where William received commendations for his service, standing in the crowd with tears in her eyes as he was recognized for his loyalty and dedication. The morning routine continued as usual. Palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, preparing for the day's activities. Gardeners tended to the immaculate flower beds, their tools creating a gentle rhythm as they worked. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, emerged from the main entrance to speak with the head groundskeeper about preparations for an upcoming garden party. William nodded respectfully to Mrs. Patterson as she passed. She had worked at the palace almost as long as he had, and they shared a mutual respect born from years of dedicated service. She paused briefly to acknowledge him with a warm smile before continuing her duties. The sound of footsteps on gravel caught William's attention. A young palace aide approached, carrying a silver tray with what appeared to be morning tea service. The aide moved with practiced efficiency, balancing the tray while navigating the uneven stones. William observed the scene with the trained eye of someone whose job it was to notice everything, no matter how seemingly insignificant. As the morning progressed, William's thoughts turned to retirement. He had been eligible to step down for several years but had chosen to continue serving. The idea of leaving the palace, of ending a career that had defined his adult life, felt both terrifying and liberating. Margaret had been gently encouraging him to consider retirement, mentioning all the things they could do together, the places they could visit, the grandchildren they might one day have. But leaving felt like abandoning his post, betraying the trust that had been placed in him. The royal family had become like his own family, and the palace grounds felt more like home than anywhere else. Every stone, every doorway, every ceremonial routine was ingrained in his memory and his heart. The sun climbed higher, warming the courtyard and creating a comfortable environment despite the formal nature of his duties. William adjusted his stance slightly, a movement so subtle that any observer would hardly notice. After 3 decades of standing at attention, he had learned to make tiny adjustments that relieved pressure without compromising his professional appearance. A delivery truck approached the service entrance, bringing fresh flowers for the palace arrangements. William watched as the driver unloaded carefully wrapped bouquets and potted plants. The palace always maintained the highest standards for its floral displays, with arrangements changed regularly to keep the interior spaces vibrant and welcoming. The driver, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a friendly demeanor, had been making deliveries to the palace for years. He nodded respectfully to William as he worked, understanding the importance of maintaining proper decorum even during routine deliveries. These small interactions, though brief and formal, were part of the daily rhythm that William had come to appreciate. Inside the palace, Prince George was attending his morning lessons. His tutor, Professor Jenkins, had arrived earlier to continue the young prince's education in history and literature. The sounds of their discussion occasionally drifted through the open windows, though the words were indistinct from William's position in the courtyard. William remembered his own education, completed in the local comprehensive school, before joining the military at 18. His path to the Royal Guard had been through the army, where he had distinguished himself through discipline, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to duty. The transition from military service to palace guard had been seamless, with many of the same values and expectations carrying forward. The training for Royal Guard duty had been intensive, covering everything from ceremonial protocols to emergency procedures. William had excelled in every aspect, earning the respect of his instructors and fellow trainees. His promotion to captain had come after 15 years of exemplary service, recognizing not only his technical skills but also his leadership abilities and deep understanding of royal traditions. A tourist group gathered near the palace gates, their guide pointing out various architectural features and sharing historical anecdotes. William could hear fragments of the presentation, stories about past monarchs, and significant events that had shaped the nation's history. These tours were a regular occurrence, bringing visitors from around the world to witness the pageantry and tradition that the Royal Guard represented. Children in the group pressed their faces against the iron gates, trying to get a better look at William and his fellow guards. Their excitement was evident, with whispered comments about the colorful uniforms and the motionless stance of the guards. William maintained his composure, though inwardly he smiled at their enthusiasm and curiosity. One little girl, perhaps 6 years old, waved enthusiastically at William despite her mother's gentle attempts to discourage the behavior. The child's innocent joy was infectious, reminding William of why his role was important beyond the security it provided. He represented something larger than himself: tradition, stability, and continuity in an ever-changing world. The morning lessons concluded, and Prince George appeared at his window again. This time, he lingered longer, looking out over the courtyard with what seemed like thoughtful consideration. William maintained his professional stance, though he was aware of the young prince's presence and apparent interest in the activities below. Prince George had grown into a serious young man, bearing the weight of his future responsibilities with remarkable grace for someone so young. William had observed him during various family events, noting his respectful demeanor and genuine interest in the people around him. Unlike some privileged youth, Prince George seemed to understand the significance of his position and the service of those around him. The palace staff began preparing for lunch, with kitchen workers moving between the service areas and dining rooms. The elaborate meal preparation was a daily spectacle that William had witnessed thousands of times, yet he never ceased to be impressed by the coordination and attention to detail that went into every aspect of royal life. Mrs. Patterson reappeared, this time conferring with the head chef about evening arrangements. Their conversation was animated but professional, covering details that would ensure the day's events proceeded flawlessly. William appreciated the dedication of all palace staff, recognizing that his role as guard was just one part of a much larger operation that required everyone to perform their duties with excellence. The afternoon shift change was still hours away, But William's thoughts began to drift toward the end of his duty period. He would return home to Margaret, perhaps help with dinner preparation, and spend the evening reading or watching television together. These simple pleasures had become more precious as he contemplated retirement, recognizing that his current schedule of alternating days on and off duty would soon give way to unlimited time at home. A maintenance worker approached to inspect one of the exterior light fixtures near William's post. The man worked quietly and efficiently, checking connections and cleaning the fixture housing. William observed the work while maintaining his vigilance, appreciating the behind-the-scenes effort that kept the palace functioning smoothly. The worker finished his task and packed his tools, nodding respectfully to William before moving on to the next fixture. These brief interactions with palace staff had become familiar over the years, creating a sense of community among all those who served the royal family in various capacities. Prince George appeared at his window once more, this time holding what looked like a book. He seemed to be reading while occasionally glancing out at the courtyard. William wondered about the young prince's studies, imagining the complex curriculum that would prepare him for his future role. The education of a future king involved far more than traditional academics, encompassing statecraft, protocol, and the subtle art of public service. The afternoon sun began to shift the shadows across the courtyard, marking the passage of time in the way that only someone standing motionless for hours could truly appreciate. William's body had adapted long ago to the physical demands of his position, but his mind remained active, processing the constant stream of observations and assessments that his role required. A palace groundskeeper approached with a wheelbarrow full of fresh mulch for the flower beds. The man worked methodically, spreading the dark material around the base of each plant with careful attention to detail. The result would be flower beds that looked perfect for any photographs or public events, maintaining the high standards that the palace was known for worldwide. William reflected on the countless photographs that had been taken of him and his fellow guards over the years. Tourist photos, official palace photography, news coverage of royal events. He had appeared in more images than he could count, usually as a background figure, representing the steadfast presence of royal security. The thought amused him slightly, imagining family albums around the world that included his stoic figure without the owners ever knowing his name or story. The afternoon stretched on with the familiar rhythm of palace life continuing around him. William's dedication to his post remained unwavering, even as his mind occasionally wandered to thoughts of the future and the significant decision that lay ahead of him. Little did he know that events were already in motion that would make that decision easier than he could have imagined. The afternoon sun had reached its peak when something unusual happened that would forever change Captain William Harris's life. As he maintained his vigilant post, a commotion erupted from within the palace. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, and the sound of doors slamming echoed through the corridors, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos that immediately put William on high alert. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the main entrance, her usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious concern. She moved quickly across the courtyard, speaking in hushed but urgent tones to other staff members who had appeared seemingly from nowhere. William's trained instincts kicked in, his eyes scanning the perimeter while his ears strained to catch any indication of the nature of the emergency. Through the open windows, William could hear heated conversation. While he couldn't make out specific words, the tone suggested a serious disagreement or crisis. His hand moved instinctively closer to his radio, ready to call for backup or coordinate with other security personnel if needed. After 3 decades of service, William had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when routine was about to be shattered. Prince George appeared at his window, no longer the casual observer but someone clearly affected by whatever was transpiring inside. The young prince's face showed concern and what appeared to be disappointment. He stood at the window for several minutes, looking down at the courtyard where William maintained his post, as if seeking some sense of stability in the midst of confusion. The palace doors opened again, and several staff members emerged carrying what looked like personal belongings. William recognized them as members of Prince George's educational team, tutors and assistants who had been part of the young prince's daily routine for years. Their departure seemed abrupt and unplanned, with boxes and briefcases hastily packed and expressions of frustration evident on their faces. Professor Jenkins, Prince George's primary tutor, paused near William's post, while waiting for transportation. The elderly academic's face was flushed with anger, and he muttered under his breath about unreasonable demands and impossible expectations. William maintained his professional composure, but he couldn't help but notice the professor's agitated state and the implication that some kind of conflict had led to his sudden departure. The professor's taxi arrived, and he loaded his belongings with sharp, jerky movements that spoke of deep frustration. As the vehicle pulled away, William caught sight of Prince George at his window, watching the departure with what could only be described as sadness. The young prince's shoulders sagged slightly, and he rested his forehead against the glass in a gesture that seemed far too mature and weary for someone his age. Over the next hour, the pattern repeated. More staff members emerged from the palace, their departures marked by the same sense of urgency and dissatisfaction. William began to piece together that whatever had happened involved Prince George's education and the people responsible for it. The turnover was unprecedented in William's experience, suggesting a conflict of significant magnitude. Mrs. Patterson approached William's post, something she had never done in all his years of service. Royal protocol typically kept household staff and security personnel in separate spheres, but the unusual circumstances seemed to warrant breaking normal procedures. She paused just outside the formal boundaries of his guard position, close enough to speak but not so close as to compromise his official duties. "Captain Harris," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years of mutual respect, "I thought you should know that there's been a significant disagreement regarding Prince George's education. Several members of his tutorial staff have resigned, citing irreconcilable differences with new directives from senior palace officials." William nodded slightly, the barest acknowledgement that he had heard and understood. "Mrs. Patterson continued, the young prince is quite upset about the situation. He's grown quite attached to his teachers, particularly Professor Jenkins. This has all happened very suddenly, and he's had no say in the matter." The information explained much of what William had observed, but it also raised new concerns. Prince George's education was crucial not only for his personal development, but for his preparation as a future king. Disrupting established relationships and routines could have far-reaching consequences for the young man's emotional and intellectual growth. Mrs. Patterson glanced up at Prince George's window, where the young prince remained visible, still watching the courtyard below. "He's been standing there for over an hour," she said softly, "just watching and thinking. I've never seen him look so troubled." After Mrs. Patterson departed, William found himself in an unusual position. His duty was to maintain security and observe, but the situation developing around Prince George seemed to call for something more. The young prince was clearly distressed, isolated by circumstances beyond his control, and dealing with changes that would affect his daily life significantly. The afternoon wore on with an unusual quiet settling over the palace. Normal activities continued, but there was an underlying tension that affected everyone's behavior. Staff members spoke in hushed tones, and there was an efficient urgency to their movements that suggested damage control was underway. William remained at his post, but his attention was increasingly drawn to the solitary figure at the window above. Prince George had not moved from his position for nearly 2 hours. His posture spoke of deep contemplation, and William suspected considerable sadness. The young prince's hands were pressed against the glass, and occasionally he would shift his weight from one foot to the other. But otherwise, he remained motionless, looking out over the courtyard where William stood. As the afternoon progressed, William began to understand something that went beyond his formal training and experience. Prince George was not just watching the courtyard randomly. He was watching William specifically. Their eyes met periodically, and there seemed to be a form of communication happening despite the distance and the protocol that separated them. The realization struck William with unexpected force. Prince George was seeking comfort and stability in the presence of someone who represented continuity and dependability. After years of observing the young prince grow up, William had become a familiar fixture in his environment, a constant presence that remained unchanged even when everything else seemed to be shifting around him. This insight brought with it a profound sense of responsibility that went beyond William's official duties. He was not just a guard protecting the palace. He had become, without realizing it, a a source of emotional security for a young man facing enormous pressures and expectations. The weight of this understanding settled on William's shoulders like a new uniform, heavier and more significant than anything he had worn before. The evening shift began to arrive, and William prepared for the formal changing of the guard ceremony that marked the end of his duty period. But as he went through the familiar motions of the handover, his mind was occupied with thoughts of Prince George and the unusual circumstances of the day. The young prince remained at his window, now silhouetted against the interior lights as evening approached. The ceremony concluded, and William was officially relieved of his post. Normally, he would have departed immediately for home, eager to share the day's events with Margaret and enjoy a quiet evening together. But something compelled him to pause and look up at Prince George's window one more time before leaving the palace grounds. Prince George was still there, still watching. When their eyes met this time, something passed between them that transcended royal protocol and formal boundaries. It was a moment of human connection, of recognition that each understood something about the other's situation and commitment. William raised his hand in the slightest of gestures, barely perceptible but unmistakably a form of acknowledgement and support. Prince George responded with an equally subtle nod. A gesture so small that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But to William, it was as significant as any formal salute or ceremonial recognition he had ever received. The exchange lasted only seconds, but its impact on both individuals was profound. William understood that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. A young prince, reaching out for human connection during a moment of isolation and uncertainty, and finding it in the steady presence of a guard who had been part of his world for as long as he could remember. As William finally departed the palace that evening, his mind was filled with new considerations about his role and its meaning. He had always understood his duty in terms of security and protocol, but the events of the day had revealed another dimension to his service. The human element that connected him to the people he protected in ways that went far beyond professional obligations. The drive home was contemplative. With William processing the day's events and their implications, Margaret would be waiting with dinner and her usual questions about his day. But he wondered how to explain what had transpired. How could he convey the significance of a silent exchange with a young prince who was struggling with changes beyond his control? When William arrived home, Margaret immediately noticed his thoughtful demeanor. After 30 years of marriage to a man in royal service, she had developed an intuitive understanding of when something significant had occurred during his duty. She waited patiently while he changed out of his uniform, knowing that he would share what he could when he was ready. Over dinner, William described the day's events in general terms, explaining about the departures of Prince George's tutorial staff and the unusual atmosphere at the palace. He spoke carefully, mindful of confidentiality requirements, but Margaret could sense there was more to the story than he was sharing. The young prince must be quite upset, Margaret observed, her natural compassion evident in her voice. To lose his teachers so suddenly, especially ones he's worked with for years. It must feel very unsettling for him. William nodded, appreciating his wife's understanding of the human aspects of royal life that often went unnoticed by the public. He seemed quite affected by it all, he acknowledged. It's not easy being in his position, especially when decisions are made for him rather than with him. Margaret studied her husband's face, recognizing signs of deeper contemplation than usual. "You're thinking about retirement again, aren't you?" she asked gently. "Something today has made you reconsider your position." William was continually amazed by Margaret's perceptiveness. "Perhaps," he admitted. "I've been thinking about what my role really means. What kind of impact it has beyond just standing guard. Today made me realize that there are aspects to this job that I hadn't fully considered before." They spent the evening discussing the complexities of royal service and the personal connections that could develop despite formal protocols. Margaret listened with the patience and understanding that had supported William throughout his career, offering insights that helped him process his thoughts and feelings about the day's events. As they prepared for bed, William found himself thinking about Prince George, wondering how the young prince was coping with the changes and whether he had anyone to talk to about his feelings regarding the situation. The thought of the 15-year-old dealing with such disruption largely alone troubled William more than he expected it would. Sleep came slowly that night, with William's mind replaying the silent exchange with Prince George and considering its broader implications. He had always been dedicated to his service, but now he was beginning to understand that dedication might mean something different than he had previously thought. The question that would face him in the coming days was whether he could best serve by continuing in his current role or by making a change that might have greater meaning for everyone involved. The following morning brought an unseasonably warm day to London, with golden sunlight streaming across the palace courtyard as Captain William Harris took his position for what would unknowingly be his final shift as a royal guard. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself glancing frequently at Prince George's window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the young prince and assess his state of mind. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the disruption to Prince George's routine was more significant than William had initially realized. No new tutors had arrived, and the usual sounds of educational activities were noticeably absent from the palace. The silence from the study rooms suggested that Prince George was spending the day alone, without the structure and companionship that his educational team had provided. Around mid-morning, Mrs. Patterson emerged from the palace carrying a tea service, but instead of heading toward the main dining areas, she walked purposefully toward the garden terrace, where Prince George had apparently chosen to spend his time. William could see the young prince sitting alone at one of the outdoor tables, books scattered around him as he attempted to continue his studies independently. The sight of Prince George trying to maintain his educational routine without guidance struck William as both admirable and heartbreaking. The young man's dedication to his responsibilities was evident, but the isolation of his situation was equally clear. He sat, surrounded by textbooks and papers, but without the discussion and interaction that effective learning required. William watched as Mrs. Patterson approached Prince George with obvious maternal concern. She set down the tea service and spoke with him briefly, her gestures suggesting gentle inquiry about his well-being. Prince George responded politely but with the subdued manner that had characterized his behavior since the previous day's disruptions. After Mrs. Patterson departed, Prince George remained at the outdoor table, but his attention seemed to drift from his books to the surrounding gardens. He appeared lost in thought, occasionally looking up from his studies to gaze across the courtyard, where William maintained his post. The young prince's expression was difficult to read from a distance, but there was a quality of contemplation that suggested he was processing more than just academic material. The lunch hour approached with little change in the palace routine, except for the continued absence of Prince George's educational team. William learned from overheard conversations among staff that interviews were being conducted for replacement tutors, but the process was moving slowly due to the specific requirements and security clearances needed for such positions. It was during the lunch period that Prince George made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking his meal in the formal dining room as protocol dictated, he asked Mrs. Patterson to prepare a simple lunch that he could eat outdoors. More significantly, he requested that a second-place setting be prepared, though he provided no explanation for who might be joining him. William observed this unusual request with growing curiosity. Prince George rarely deviated from established routines, and the idea of an impromptu outdoor lunch with an unnamed guest was highly irregular. Palace security protocols required advance notice of any visitors, and the mysterious second-place setting raised immediate questions about who Prince George might be expecting to join him. The mystery was resolved in a way that left William stunned and deeply moved. After the lunch service was arranged on the garden terrace, Prince George rose from his seat and walked purposefully across the courtyard toward William's post. The young prince's movements were deliberate and confident, suggesting a decision that had been carefully considered despite its unprecedented nature. Royal protocol strictly forbade direct interaction between guards and family members outside of emergency situations, but Prince George appeared unconcerned with such formalities as he approached William's position. The young prince stopped just outside the formal boundary of William's guard post, close enough for conversation but respectful of the physical space that duty required. "Captain Harris," Prince George said quietly, his voice carrying the distinctive tone of someone who had given considerable thought to his words. "I wonder if I might request something quite unusual of you." William maintained his formal stance but inclined his head slightly to indicate that he was listening. The situation was unprecedented in his 3 decades of service, but his respect for Prince George and concern for the young man's well-being outweighed his uncertainty about protocol. I've been thinking quite a lot about yesterday's events, Prince George continued, his words measured and mature beyond his years. The departure of my tutors has left me in a rather awkward position, and I find myself in need of perspective that might be difficult to obtain through traditional channels. The young prince paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. I've observed you for many years, Captain Harris, and I've always been struck by your dedication and wisdom. You've served my family with such distinction, and I believe you've learned quite a lot about duty, responsibility, and the complexities of service during your time here. William felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty as he listened to Prince George's words. The young prince's insight and maturity were impressive, but the direction of the conversation was leading toward territory that challenged everything William understood about his role and responsibilities. What I'm wondering, Prince George said, his voice gaining confidence, is whether you might be willing to join me for lunch and share some of your perspective about service, duty, and what it means to balance personal desires with larger responsibilities. I realize this is highly irregular, but I find myself in need of conversation with someone who understands these concepts from experience rather than theory. The request was so unexpected and so thoughtful that William found himself momentarily speechless. In all his years of service, he had never been asked to step outside his official role in such a personal way. Prince George was essentially asking him to abandon his post and join him as an equal in conversation about the very principles that defined both of their lives. Your Highness, William said carefully, his training warring with his desire to help the young man who was clearly struggling with difficult circumstances. I am honored by your request, but I must consider the protocols and my duties as they have been defined. Prince George nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this response. I understand your concerns, Captain Harris, and I respect your dedication to protocol, but I would like you to consider something. My education has been disrupted, and I am currently without the guidance that has been deemed essential for my development. In seeking conversation with someone of your experience and character, am I not pursuing my education in a different, but equally valid form? The logic was compelling and demonstrated the kind of creative thinking that would serve Prince George well in his future role. William realized that the young prince was not asking him to abandon his duties, but to fulfill them in a new way, by providing the kind of guidance and perspective that formal education might not offer. Furthermore, Prince George added, I believe that understanding the experiences and perspectives of those who serve the crown is an essential part of my education as a future king. Who better to provide that understanding than someone who has dedicated his life to such service with such distinction? William felt the weight of the decision before him. On one hand, decades of training and protocol demanded that he maintain his post and decline the invitation. On the other hand, a young man who would one day be his king was asking for help in a moment of genuine need, and the request itself demonstrated wisdom and respect that commanded admiration. The moment stretched on as William considered his options, aware that Prince George was waiting patiently for his response. The young prince's expression showed understanding of the difficulty of the situation, but also hope that William might find a way to accept the invitation. Finally, William made a decision that surprised even himself. Your Highness, he said formally, if you believe that sharing my perspective would contribute to your education and development, then I consider it my duty to accept your invitation. However, I must first arrange for proper security coverage of this post. Prince George's face lit up with a smile that transformed his serious expression into something much more befitting a 15-year-old. Of course, Captain Harris, I wouldn't want to compromise security procedures. I'll wait while you make the necessary arrangements. William used his radio to contact the security office, explaining that Prince George had requested his assistance with an educational matter that would require him to leave his post temporarily. The unusual nature of the request caused some confusion, but William's reputation and seniority ensured that backup coverage was arranged quickly. As William prepared to step away from his post for the first time in his career, for personal rather than emergency reasons, he felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He was about to engage with Prince George as a person rather than as a protected individual, and the responsibility of that interaction felt enormous. Prince George led the way to the garden terrace where the lunch had been prepared. The setting was simple but elegant, with fresh flowers on the table and a view of the palace gardens that created an atmosphere of relaxed conversation. As they took their seats, William realized that he was experiencing something that few people in his position ever had: the opportunity to interact with royalty as a human being rather than as a professional duty. "Thank you for accepting my invitation, Captain Harris," Prince George said as they began their meal. "I hope you'll feel comfortable speaking frankly with me. I'm genuinely interested in your perspective on service and duty, particularly how you've balanced your personal life with the demands of your position." Over the next hour, William found himself sharing stories and insights from his 3 decades of service that he had never discussed with anyone outside his immediate family. Prince George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both intelligence and genuine curiosity about the experiences of those who served the crown. The conversation covered topics ranging from the challenges of maintaining personal relationships while fulfilling demanding professional obligations to the sense of purpose that came from dedicating one's life to something larger than individual interests. Prince George shared his own struggles with the expectations placed upon him and his desire to serve effectively while remaining true to his personal values. As their conversation deepened, William began to understand that Prince George possessed a level of emotional intelligence and wisdom that would serve him well in his future role. The young prince's questions revealed careful thought about leadership, responsibility, and the human cost of service that impressed William greatly. "Captain Harris," Prince George said as their lunch concluded, "I want you to know how much this conversation has meant to me. In a time when I've felt quite isolated and uncertain, you've provided exactly the kind of perspective and wisdom that I needed. Your service to my family has been exemplary, but your willingness to share your experience today has been extraordinary." William felt deeply moved by the young prince's words and by the experience they had shared. "Your Highness, the honor has been entirely mine. Your thoughtfulness in seeking different perspectives on service and leadership demonstrates exactly the kind of wisdom that will make you an exceptional king." Prince George smiled, but then his expression became more serious. "Captain Harris, I have one more request. And this one may be even more unusual than the first. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the balance between personal desires and larger responsibilities, and I believe I understand something about your current situation." William waited, uncertain where this might be leading but trusting in the wisdom that Prince George had demonstrated throughout their conversation. "I suspect that you've been considering retirement," Prince George continued, "but that you've been reluctant to leave because of your sense of duty and loyalty. Is that correct?" The insight was so accurate that William could only nod in acknowledgement. Prince George had somehow understood the internal conflict that had been troubling William for months. "What I want to tell you," Prince George said, "is that your service has been so exemplary and your dedication so complete that you have earned the right to pursue your personal happiness without any sense of abandoning your duty. In fact, I believe that you stepping down now, after this conversation, and the wisdom you've shared with me, would be a perfect conclusion to an honorable career." The words hit William with unexpected force. Here was the young man he had protected and observed growing up, giving him permission to pursue retirement without guilt or regret. More than permission. Prince George was suggesting that retirement would be the right choice, the honorable choice. "Furthermore," Prince George added, "I want you to know that the impact of your service extends far beyond security or protocol. You've been a constant, stabilizing presence during my entire life, and that has meant more than you might realize. Your dedication has taught me about commitment and honor in ways that no textbook ever could." William felt tears threatening to form in his eyes, moved by the unexpected recognition and understanding from someone whose opinion mattered more than he had realized. Prince George was not just releasing him from duty, he was honoring his service in a way that made retirement feel like a reward rather than an abandonment. As they prepared to conclude their unprecedented meeting, Prince George stood and extended his hand to William in a gesture of respect that transcended their official relationship. "Captain Harris, thank you for 30 years of dedicated service, and thank you for today's conversation. You have my gratitude, my respect, and my permission to pursue whatever comes next in your life with no regrets about the service you're leaving behind." William shook the young prince's hand, feeling the significance of the moment settling around them both. In a single afternoon, everything had changed. He had found the resolution he had been seeking about retirement, and he had gained a deeper understanding of the true meaning of his service. As William returned to his post for the final hours of his shift, he carried with him not just the memory of an extraordinary conversation but also a sense of completion that he had never expected to find. Prince George had given him something more valuable than any formal recognition: the knowledge that his service had mattered in deeply personal ways, and that his departure would be understood and respected. That evening, William submitted his retirement request, confident for the first time that he was making the right choice at the right time. The decision had been made not out of fatigue or frustration, but out of a sense of fulfilled purpose, and the wisdom that sometimes the greatest service comes from knowing when to step aside. When William told Margaret about his decision over dinner, he shared as much as he could about the day's extraordinary events. She listened with the understanding and support that had sustained him throughout his career, recognizing that something significant had shifted in her husband's perspective on his service and his future. "It sounds like Prince George is going to be a remarkable king," Margaret observed after hearing about their conversation. "And it sounds like your 30 years of service contributed to that in ways you never expected." William nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction about both his career and his decision to conclude it. "I think he will be extraordinary," he agreed, "and I'm grateful that I was able to be part of his journey, even in a small way." As they prepared for bed on what would be William's last night as an active royal guard, he reflected on the unexpected turn his final day of service had taken. He had begun the day as he had thousands of others, but he was ending it with a new understanding of the impact his dedication had made and a sense of peace about the future that lay ahead. The next morning, William would begin the formal process of transitioning out of royal service, but he would carry with him the knowledge that his 3 decades of dedication had been recognized and valued by the young man who mattered most. Prince George's wisdom and kindness had provided the perfect conclusion to an honorable career, and William's retirement would be marked not by regret but by gratitude for the extraordinary opportunity he had been given to serve.